Okay, so I have an image of Hitler's, I think nemesis is too strong a word. It's his rival, Lord Halifax, and I'll talk about Halifax in just a second. But just let me remind you, Churchill had a very checkered history in the 1930s. Was a politician he'd been around British politics since the early 1900s. He served in the War Cabinet during World War One. His father was a very prominent politician in Great Britain. And in the 1930s, Churchill had been sidelined because he was so loud in his denunciations of Hitler. He saw that Hitler was a danger much more quickly than a lot of the British. But also, Churchill did some very controversial, let's put it like that. He made some controversial or took some controversial positions during the 1930s. Surprisingly, he supported Edward, the king that wanted to marry the American heiress. Churchill actually supported that and supported Edward, which is kind of shocking, given that Edward basically became sympathetic to Hitler. But Churchill was very public in his support of King Edward. Uh, Also, Churchill was extremely uh, opposed to Great Britain losing its control of India. Great Britain, of course, had an empire, and the jewel of the empire was India. And in the 1930s, there was a big push to let India be run by its own people instead of control from Great Britain. Churchill was adamantly opposed to that, and it put him out of step with a majority of the people of Great Britain. He also said some racist things, made some racist statements against the great Indian leader Gandhi, and so he was an imperialist. So he was out of step there. But when it came to Hitler, you've got to give Churchill credit. He saw Hitler very, very quickly. Not quickly, he saw quickly that Hitler was a danger, and he saw Hitler clearly that Hitler had to be stopped. And he was one of the very few prominent voices in Great Britain. He's giving speeches, he's writing newspaper editorials, articles saying we need to rearm. And the British had, again, as I talked about in class, they were very suspicious of going into war again, getting trapped into a war again. They didn't want to rebuild their army, didn't want to rebuild their navy. They were not happy, the British public, with the outcome of World War One. Although the British had won, World War One had been oversold as the war to end all wars, and the British public is very, very reluctant to go toe to toe with Great Britain, with Germany again. And the other thing is, a lot of British feel like the threat of Hitler is overblown. That it's just propaganda. That really Hitler wasn't as bad as people like Churchill were saying. And most importantly, as I said in class, or stressed in class on Thursday, also many in Great Britain, especially the British elite, thought that Hitler was a buffer against Stalin. And that actually not only was Stalin more dangerous than Hitler, that Hitler in some respects was doing the West, France and England, a favor by opposing Stalin. But Churchill didn't buy any of that. He looked at Hitler, and Churchill was a staunch anti-communist, but he just saw the danger of Hitler. Let me talk real quickly about his opponent, Lord Halifax. Lord Halifax, his name was Edward Frederick Lindley. He was from the aristocratic class in Great Britain. His nickname was the Holy Fox, which is kind of a play on, Lord Halifax. He was a passionate hunter. He's very strict, very moralist. He had tremendous authority in Great Britain. He had a lot of prestige in Great Britain. He was a very, very powerful political figure in Great Britain at this time. And he was one of the folks in Great Britain. I wouldn't say that he was sympathetic to Hitler. I think that's going way too far. But at the same time, he's not someone that wants to go to war with Hitler. He meets with Hitler before the Munich conference. There's not a lot of funny anecdotes in this course, but this anecdote is pretty funny. Halifax later wrote in his memoirs, so he rolled up to where Hitler was. He wrote, and this is a quote, on eye level, I saw in the middle of this swept path a pair of black trousered legs, finishing up in socks and pumps. I assumed this was a footman who had come down to help me out of the car and up the steps, and was proceeding in a leisurely fashion to get me out of the car when I heard the German foreign minister or somebody saying in a hoarse whisper at my ear, Der Fuhrer, der Fuhrer. And then it dawned on me that the legs were not the legs of a footman, but of Hitler. So when Halifax rolls up to Hitler's place, um, Hitler comes to the door to open him, and for a second, Halifax thinks it's, a butler, basically. Anyway, they talk for 3 hours. Halifax, nothing really comes of it. Halifax doesn't scare Hitler at all. And, he talks in vague generalities about how it's a bad thing if Hitler goes into Czechoslovakia, but he certainly doesn't take a hard line, not the hard line that Churchill would have taken. So Chamberlain and Hitler talk, nothing really comes out of it. And just to fast forward to the crisis in May of 1940, the British Prime Minister Chamberlain had resigned. He had been the prime minister during the Munich crisis. He'd been the one that had made the deal with Hitler that allowed Hitler to go into Western Czechoslovakia. And ultimately, of course, Hitler takes all of Czechoslovakia. So by the May of 1940, Chamberlain has lost all public support. He resigns. And Lord Halifax, the King of England, King George, offers Lord Halifax the post of Prime Minister. But Halifax declined it. For whatever reason, maybe he just didn't feel like he was up to the task. He shied away from it. Maybe he didn't feel like he had the necessary public support. Well, he never really made it clear why he turned down being prime minister. But by turning down being prime minister, this allowed Churchill to become prime minister. Halifax turned down the job. Churchill was next in line. And King George, who thought Churchill was a loose cannon, reluctantly offered Churchill the position of prime minister. And Churchill, unlike Halifax, was very, very eager to take on this responsibility. It's something he'd been thinking about. It's something he'd been dreaming about. He always felt that he would be he had this sense of destiny. If you ever go to the War Room in London, it's a cool place to go. Don't go in the summer if you can avoid it. It gets really crowded. It's just a little bit below ground level. It's where Churchill had his headquarters. It's an amazing place. They preserved it as it was in the 1940s. But there's also a great museum. They preserved it as it was in the 1940s. But there's also a great museum there, a great Winston Churchill Museum. And Churchill had a remarkable life. Although he did, like I say, make a number of mistakes. And one of the signs that you see, it's in neon as you walk in. Churchill is quoted as saying, "Yes, like all human beings, I'm a worm, but at least I'm a glowworm," which I thought was really funny. It kind of, Churchill's a man of destiny, right? He believes that it's his destiny to take over control of England at a critical time, and that's exactly what happens. So, but when he comes into office, he doesn't have complete power. He has to deal with other personalities in the War Cabinet. Above all, he has to deal with Lord Halifax. Lord Halifax had turned down the post of prime minister. He had turned it down, but he's still hugely influential in British politics, and he's hugely influential among the Conservative Party, which was the party that Churchill belonged to. So if Halifax had turned against Churchill very early in Churchill's time as prime minister, it would have forced Churchill to resign. He has to mollify Halifax. He can't just oppose him outright. He has to maneuver around Halifax because Halifax still has so much influence in the British Parliament. So it's in this context that the War Cabinet meets on May 27th, 1940. Again, the Dunkirk evacuation is taking place. It's going much better than anybody anticipated. It's kind of a miracle. And that's where Hitler, I don't know why I keep doing this. That's where Churchill and Halifax square off.